This is Fusion Capitalism, a clean energy vision for conservatives. Brought to you by industry leader and company CEO, Steve Malink. Here's Steve.
Joining me today is Jody Freeman. Jody is a Harvard Law professor and director of the school's Environmental and Energy Law program. She also served as a counselor for energy and climate change in the Obama White House. Jody, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
Jody, for the first part of my interview, I'd like to get your thoughts on the executive branch of our government as it relates to our climate in the upcoming presidential election. In your opinion, what will be the likely impact to our climate 4 years from now if President Trump gets reelected versus if former Vice President Biden gets elected?
It's a great question because I think you couldn't have a starker comparison between the two. I mean, Trump has made it his agenda to unravel and weaken every Obama-era climate standard and a bunch of environmental standards that aren't even climate change related. It's been an all-out assault on environmental protection, really from the start of the administration. It's been systematic, and I cannot think of another regulatory rollback with as much focus, determination, and energy in it across any administration as this one has been to really unwind environmental protection and climate change. So if Trump were reelected, I would expect more of that. I would expect a kind of doubling down on the deregulatory agenda. And notably, he has gone further. His agencies have gone further in weakening regulation, health, safety, environment, climate, beyond what industry has asked for in many instances, which is unheard of. So I would expect more of the same. I would expect his continuing antipathy toward international agreements like the Paris Agreement. So I think it would be quite devastating to lose another 4 years on the clean energy transition compared to what I would expect from a Biden administration, which would be not just back to the Obama era support for climate rules and effort to get climate legislation passed. That was true of the Obama presidency, and especially in Obama's second term. You know, we saw a real effort to get the Clean Power Plan adopted, and the president led the way on the Paris Agreement. I would expect that the Biden administration would want to use that as a foundation, but go still further. So I would expect Biden to try to make good on all of the pledges he's made to get to a zero carbon electricity sector by 2035 and put the country on a path to net zero emissions by 2050. I mean, those are big goals. And I would expect Biden to use all the levers of the executive branch, which we could talk about, and also propose legislation to get that done.
To what degree do you think market forces are already baked in relative to climate action? In other words, whether Trump or Biden is in the office, many U.S. corporations are already leading the way to a clean economy. In the fossil fuel industry, especially coal and oil, is reeling under these pressures. How much of what's going to happen in the next 4 years is a function of who's president versus how corporate America continues to operate?
It's interesting because market forces are certainly at work in driving a switch from coal to natural gas, because natural gas is so cheap now that fracking has unleashed it from shale, and it's turned out to be abundant in the United States and cheaper than coal. So it's true that there are market forces going in the direction of a cleaner electricity supply, but there's a bit of a phony narrative going around that, you know, just let the market do its work and we'll all end up with drastically reduced greenhouse gas emissions, everything will be fine. I don't think that's right. I think that we could be much further ahead of where we are now if we had policies backing up the market direction. If you have the combination, right, the market moving toward cleaner energy, but then you have a set of government policies that help to support innovation, help to drive those emissions further down, help to support renewables so they can also displace coal in the electricity sector. And then if you have the government supporting transportation sector policies, which we desperately need and which the market is not helping with, because there the market is, of course, producing very, very cheap oil, which means gas prices are low, which means people aren't incentivized to buy fuel-efficient cars. So there the market's going in the wrong direction. My point is really to say the market's doing a lot, which is great. but you need a marriage of market and government policies. And I agree with you that there are leaders in corporate America that are doing the right things, making a lot of bets and investments on the future, but that's not systematic across the board. And I think you want to send a market signal to industry that we're headed in this direction so they can get their investments lined up with it.
Would you say that putting a price on carbon would be the single most important act that the new administration could put into effect?
Yes, without a doubt. You have to price the thing that you're trying to control, right? I mean, we need to make it expensive to pollute in order to incentivize the development of technology that will reduce pollution. So it's logical, it makes sense. We need to price carbon one way or another. And, a carbon tax right now is what industry has said it's willing to support, including the oil and gas industry, notably. But there are other ways to do it, and I think there will be a big political debate. If we get to a price on carbon, there'll be a debate about, well, what form should this take? Where should the revenue go from the tax? Or if it were another source of raising revenue, like people still talk about capping carbon and creating a set of allowances that can be bought and sold in a market regime. There are various ways to do this, but at bottom, there are going to be questions about design, how to do it in a way that accomplishes the climate goal, which is reducing greenhouse gases, but also in a way that will be fair, that will be equitable, that will send the revenue where it ought to go. And as you hear now in the political debate in the United States, increasingly people acknowledge you need some attention to environmental justice issues because of disproportionate burdens historically on our minority communities. And also people are talking about a fair transition across the board. So you need to deal with the vulnerable communities like coal communities and others that are going to suffer somewhat from job transition. So I think your point about a price on carbon is absolutely crucial, but you have to bring along with that some policy around how do you ease this process and how do you make it fair and equitable.
And do Democrats have to take the Senate in order for putting a price on carbon to happen? Or could that somehow be implemented through an executive order if viewed necessary?
Yeah, you can't get a national price on carbon without legislation. You need the Congress to pass a law. You can use regulations to do some things, right? You can set some standards. Again, this would be reversing the Trump reversals, right? But you could set standards for methane pollution from oil and gas operations. You could set standards for fuel efficiency, greenhouse gas standards for cars and trucks. You could set standards for the power sector. And that is an indirect way of pricing carbon. But that's sector specific, and it's limited by the existing authority that EPA and some other agencies have. And there is no way with existing law to do a kind of national carbon tax or national cap and trade system. So yeah, you need Congress to act. I think it's fair to say if you don't get a change in control of the Senate, that becomes pretty impossible to imagine. I mean, you need to flip the Senate. Even once you do, right, it's not clear that you can get a climate policy or a set of them through the Senate, even when you have the majority, unless you've got a solid majority and unless you design it in a way to attract some Democrats who will be in a tough spot, right, with energy policy. So it's not a matter of just having the majority. I think it's a little more complicated.
Sure. So I'm not an environmental lawyer, and I'm sure most of our listeners are not either. But to what degree is the threat of lawsuits and imposing liabilities on corporate balance sheets another strategy to getting fossil fuel companies to decarbonize in the next 10 to 20 years? Are the laws in place that would allow us increasingly to move in that direction?
There have been a series of lawsuits against the oil and gas industry, the utility sector, and other big companies that end up producing a lot of greenhouse gases, either directly or through their products. And they have not been very successful in the United States. And we saw a first round of this some years ago, right after the Supreme Court decided Massachusetts versus EPA, the big Supreme Court case that says EPA can regulate greenhouse gases. We saw a spate of these lawsuits, and now we've seen another surge of them in the last few years, all trying to hold accountable the biggest producers of GHGs in the US And they just have not been successful in the courts. And the reason is that the way the legal system works and the way the legal tests work for holding companies liable is it's a very high bar to show causation, to show that their emissions are, quote, causing the problem, right? Because, of course, climate change is a global phenomenon and there are many, many contributors, not just in the US, but around the world. And then linking that emissions themselves to particular harms is hard to do. And in law, you have to meet certain tests. And the courts have been reluctant to not just take these cases, but then when they hear them, they often declare that they're not justiciable, meaning they're not cases that the court should rule in. They're cases that are meant for the political bodies to resolve. They should be resolved by legislatures. And then finally, there's this causation issue I mentioned. So they've been burdened. These lawsuits have been burdened by some hurdles. So I think they're going to keep appearing and we'll keep seeing them because they are a strategy, right, to keep these issues in the political conversation, to try to pressure industry. So I don't see them disappearing, but I'm just, so far, they just have not met with success.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's some other strategies that have done more,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
And it seems to me this is as much a demand question as a supply question. In other words, is there an opportunity to go after the users? You know, I'm going to refer to carbon as a drug. Go after the
Right.
drug users as much as we may have attempted to go after the drug pushers in the past.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And,
We've met the enemy, right? And the enemy is us.
yes.
So we are all, to greater or lesser extent, dependent on fossil energy still. So the idea that we would see sort of legal strategies around suing consumers, I think the political viability of that's pretty low.
If not the individual consumers, go after the largest consumers. In the same way that you're going after the largest producers.
Yeah, I'm not sure I see what you would sue them for the demand, for the need. I'm not sure I see the angle there. I think when you sue the producers, the argument is they're liable for the harm. So you'd have to, develop some argument that the producers are somehow liable for the harm because they want energy.
Would you say the same thing about the large investment firms and lending institutions who are helping finance these fossil fuel companies?
I think that these strategies may be on the table for some organizations or states that are looking to use the courts this way. I think that, like I say, there's just a lot of hurdles, and the more and more remote you get, that is, the further you get away from the direct production of the greenhouse gases, sort of the harder and harder causation gets. So I think there are just some strategies here that are maybe going to turn out to be more promising. So, for example, what's happening in the investment community is really interesting. The demand for disclosure from the investment community around climate-related risk. This is not driven by the government. It's not driven by lawsuits from environmental organizations. It's driven by investors and banks and financial institutions that are pressuring companies to analyze their exposure and convey it clearly to shareholders. And I think that pressure has been very successful. I think it's gotten the attention of the oil and gas industry and a lot of other industries as well.
And I wonder if some of that pressure has come from the lawsuits that you were talking about before. And so there could be a link between pursuing lawsuits and having those investors and lending institutions see what might be coming down the pike.
Yeah, I do think it's hard to see how all the strategies may work together. But I guess I'd say at the most general level, the pressure coming from all of these quarters, right? Pressure from legal action, from lawsuits, pressure from the investment community, pressure in the electoral process, right? Trying to hold people who are elected to public office to account for their votes on climate change. I think all of those things are working together in kind of a complex way to change the incentive system and also to change the narrative, to keep the conversation about the importance of the issue front and center. And I think sort of everybody's playing a role. The Green New Deal plays a role in that, right? The Green New Deal changed the conversation, created a focal point. I mean, every piece of this has been pushing toward a kind of reckoning with the need for the country to do something more organized, more comprehensive, more serious about climate change. So I think it all contributes.
And ultimately, the most valuable asset of any corporation is its brand, its reputation. And that's why I'm thinking it's as much of a market forces kind of impact that's moving us towards a clean economy more than anything else. Although I'd love to see more government action, I'm just not wanting to wait longer. And hopefully that won't be an issue with the presidential election. But as a businessman, I resort to things that I can try to help control.
Right. I guess I have a little different perspective than you on that. I'm not sure it's mostly the market. I would say it's important to credit market dynamics with some of this. Like I say, I think the natural gas revolution has been critical to helping displace coal for sure. But I don't think it's just the market. I think there are a lot of states that are in the game, particularly California and New York. I mean, the leadership states that have put in place a lot of policies. And in addition, not just blue states, right? We see red states with renewable portfolio standards trying to clean up their electricity sector. They don't always call it climate policy, right? Because it's not politically very viable, but they do call it, economic policy. And you see a lot of wind, and you see a lot of solar development, you see a lot of investment in renewables. I mean, look at Texas and wind.
Right.
So I think that there's a combination of state level policies and market forces and some leftover federal policies from the Obama era that are at work together. That's how I think about it.
I see. Yeah, good. Okay, so far we've covered the executive branch. Coming up in part 2 of my interview with Jody Freeman, the director of Harvard's Environmental and Energy Law program, Jody weighs in on the monumental shift that's taken place in the judicial branch.
It's probably incrementally harder for environmentalists to win with an Amy Coney Barrett added to the existing conservative majority. In all these respects, make it a bit harder for environmentalists to first get into court. And then, what they meet is skepticism about regulation when they get there.
And just a reminder, my new book, Fusion Capitalism, A Clean Energy Vision for Conservatives, hits bookstores tomorrow and is available wherever books are sold.
Thanks for listening to Fusion Capitalism. To find out more about Steve Malink and his book, go to fusioncapitalism.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.